The session will now begin. Please.
Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome back to stream 3. In this session, we discuss food and nutrition problems, particularly focused in developing regions. This morning, we had a plenary session where we discussed agriculture, food, and nutrition issue in more global scale. And this afternoon, we like to be focused on developing regions because food and nutrition and agriculture, those problems are much more prominent as serious issues in developing regions. And this morning, we discussed food and nutrition issue globally, and probably stayed in more identifying the current problems, also conceptual aspect, and so on. And this afternoon, since we have 45 minutes with 4 excellent panelists, I'd like to propose that we get into more specifics and especially required actions, not just the talk, but what should be done. And also, we'd like to hear from panelists some successful example of some efforts trying to solve the problems. So first, I'd like to introduce panelists. Actually, 3 of them functioned as a panelist this morning. But anyway, I'd like to introduce once more, since some of you didn't attend a morning session. The person next to me, Dr. Akin Adesina, President of African Development Bank. And before that, he was a Minister of Agriculture of Nigeria, which is the most populous country in Africa. Then next one, Dr. Howdy Boyce. Yeah. He's by education economist, but through activities, he became a nutritionist, and especially he's a world expert on micronutrients. And he received the World Food Prize 2016. And I forget that Dr. Akin Adesina was a recipient of a World Food Prize of last year. And Dr. Marion Guilou, she's from France. She's a president of AgroAnim. She is expert in soil, water, and food science issues. So she covers many disciplines and areas. She has many years of experience. And then, last person but not least, Dr. Finn Kidland, Nobel Prize laureate in economics of 2004. So you see, we have an excellent panelist. So I would like to start asking some of the questions. And however, I want to have this session to be interactive and spontaneous. So if you like it, you can interrupt me or as a panelist to make more active discussion. And also, I like to have 10 minutes or so to receive questions from you, from audience. This is a great opportunity for you to ask a question to great minds of the world. So this is our overall strategy that I, as a moderator, like to try out this session. So I start asking a question, somewhat provocative, starting with Dr. Aki Adesina. Before current job as a president of African Development Bank, you are a minister of agriculture of Nigeria, which is the most populous country in Africa continent. And I'm sure you had huge challenges to nourish your people, huge sense of responsibility. What was the most challenging issue that you faced as a minister of agriculture of Nigeria?
Well, thanks very much. I think for me, when I came in as Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, the biggest challenge obviously is how do you feed a population of 180 million people? And that requires actually looking at how agriculture is taken. And so when I came in, I was particularly surprised that agriculture has been taken for so long as a development activity. It was not really taken as a business. That's the first thing. And second, there was too much government in agriculture, and there was very little private sector in agriculture. I found, of course, this was one of the most risky things I did was I found that because of that nature of government in it, it was a highly corrupt system of rent-seeking, especially on the fertilizer sector, which for about 40 years, the government will always buy and sell fertilizers that never really got to farmers. So it was a big rent-seeking sector. And also, it was surprising to me that people will look at farmers not as entrepreneurs, but they will look at them as people you need to help. And so those are some of the things that I saw. And the issue of the corruption was the one that I had to take on very quickly, because I found that no more than roughly 11% of the fertilizers bought and sold by government ever got to the farmers. And so it ended up in the farms of large people. There was a lot of it exported, and there was a lot of round-tripping going on. And I remember Martha telling my wife, I say, honey, look, I'm about to embark on my biggest reform, but I'm not sure whether I'm going to come back alive. Because if we can't get seeds and fertilizers to farmers, then forget productivity growth in agriculture. But that's where the power of technology comes in. What we did was we turned to the power of the mobile phones, and we registered the farmers in the country and got all their biometric information via the mobile phones. And I woke up one morning after we set up the system, and I announced to the country that effective from today, government will no longer buy and sell fertilizer in Nigeria. The private sector will do that, because if you are looking for pop soda in a rural area, you don't need government. You go there, you'll find it. So why is government selling seeds and fertilizers? And so we did that, and we started sending vouchers to farmers over their mobile phones and cut off all the middlemen that's in the middle right there. And it was a huge success. We were able to reach 15 million farmers getting their seeds and fertilizers essentially via their mobile phones with vouchers, which is incredible. And that included 2.5 million women farmers. And I remember, Masa, you worked in Nigeria, so you know the northern part of the country. I went there, and I was in one of these big irrigated perimeters. And these women come in, and they were wearing powder. And if you know Nigeria, in the north of the country, we have a lot of security challenges. And there was a fear by my security guards that perhaps I might be harmed or something like that. I didn't feel threatened. And when the women got closer, they took off and they put their hands into their guards, and they pulled out their mobile phones. And they said, well, Honorable Minister, we get our fertilizers now by phone, seed by phone, and the men cannot cheat us anymore. and that was one of the exciting things that I saw. And what happened, Masa, was this allowed us to increase the percentage of farmers that got access to seed and fertilizers that was subsidized by government from 11% to what it was before we started the approach. We moved it to 94%. And that allowed the country to increase its food production by an additional 21 million metric tons. And so I think we shifted agriculture from one in which farmers were dependent on government to one there you have a lot more transparency, accountability, and for me, it brought dignity to a farmer, that the farmer doesn't have to beg anybody, that they were able to get what belongs to them through a mobile technology. Today, we are scaling that up, that e-wallet system, to about 30 countries in Africa. The World Bank has taken that same system. They've taken it to Afghanistan, which last year they tried to reach 1 million farmers with it. So I think it's the power of technology, changing the mindset of around agriculture, which I found was a way in which you tackle corruption, which was one of the main endemic things that I saw when I was minister, when I started.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. King. Later I come back asking a similar kind of question as a challenge as a president of African Development Banks, so be prepared. So meanwhile, I'd like to move to the next person, Howdy. You have done such excellent work on micronutrients. And some of the audience may not be that familiar with the importance of micronutrients. Could you describe a little bit what is a micronutrients, why so important? Yeah. And then probably we'd like to hear of your successful example, how you could make an improvement of micronutrients.
Yeah, when I started working as an economist at the International Food Policy Research Institute, I was assigned to look at nutrition problems, and we needed a barometer for what was good nutrition, what was bad nutrition. And back then, it was calories, it was energy, was our barometer. But when I did my research and I looked at relationships between diets and nutrition outcomes, such as anthropometry, what kept coming up was it was dietary quality that was related. It wasn't their calorie intakes. And so at the same time, nutritionists, the nutrition community was discovering also the huge problem of mineral and vitamin deficiencies. So they gave vitamin A capsules to, say, the first trial was 10,000 children in Indonesia, one high-dose vitamin A capsule, and they gave 10,000 children a placebo. And they were astonished to find that the mortality rate among the children who got the vitamin A capsule was 30% lower than the children who got the placebo. They had no idea that vitamin A deficiency was such a huge public health problem. And they did the same type of trials in 8 other countries, and they discovered on average it reduced mortality by 23%. Then they started looking at iron deficiency. Iron deficiency for children who are preschool children impaired their cognitive developments throughout their lifetime. And then zinc deficiency, it's now estimated that zinc deficiency, which helps, when it's sufficient, it helps the immune system. 450,000 deaths each year are caused by zinc deficiency among preschool children. Mm-hmm. So this is just, very briefly, it gives you a hint of how serious mineral and vitamin deficiencies are. It's estimated that 2 billion people in the world, especially women and children, are subject to iron and zinc deficiencies.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you want me to get into the solutions now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So why? I mean, why are 2 billion people suffering from these deficiencies? Well, you have to go back to agriculture. Now, if I can comment on the discussion this afternoon, this morning, one of my pet peeves is people talk about food. Can we produce enough food? I want to divide, it's still simplistic, but I want to divide food into food staples and also non-staple foods. It's vegetables, non-staple foods, vegetables, fruits, animal products that are rich in minerals and vitamins. It's your dietary quality that prevents you from suffering from these deficiencies. The world has done a great job in the production of food staples. We have enough food when you talk about food staples. But I feel, my own opinion is, we do not have enough food when you talk about non-staple foods. The prices of rice, of wheat, have not changed in the last 50 years. The price today is about what the price was 50 years ago. But the prices of fruits and vegetables and animal products are double and triple what they were 50 years ago. Those prices have been rising steadily. So if you're poor, it gets harder and harder to afford dietary quality. So the underlying cause is that food systems have not been producing enough minerals and vitamins. And the rising prices are the indicator that the supplies are not high enough. So one of the things that we've done in Harvest Plus, the program that I and a few people started in 2003, we started putting more vitamin, iron, and zinc in the food supply by conventional plant breeding, breeding more zinc into rice, breeding more provitamin A into maize, breeding more iron into beans. These are the food staples that the poor eat in large quantities day in and day out. They're just as high yielding as the non-biofortified varieties. They sell for the same price. So we're in the process now of scaling up these varieties. 180 varieties of 12 different biofortified crops have been developed, have been released. They've been released in 35 countries now, and in another 3 or 4 years they will have been released in 60 countries. So now we're in the process of trying to scale up and get the biofortified varieties to replace the non-biofortified varieties. And so we're getting larger amounts of these vitamin A, iron, and zinc in the diets of poor people.
Okay, thank you. I remember that when I was at the elementary school, we had a school lunch, and we had to take a vitamin A tablet. So some of you who are older as mine, you had a similar experience of having a school lunch with a vitamin A tablet. But with a biofortification approach, by eating a nutritious crop, you can address vitamin A deficiency. Marion, this morning you touched the importance of a soil. And general Japanese public, we understand that how important the soil. And the question would be that how we can improve soil condition or soil fertility or soil health. We know that it's important, but how we can make it happen?
Thank you. Yes, the soil is a very important opportunity. Let's see that there are problems, of course, erosion, salinity, decrease of the carbon content, decrease of the organic matter content. So you have a lot of problems linked to soils in the world and increasing problems. But we can look at the solution side as well. That is to say, what can we do about it? And of course, it's not the only solution, and it depends on the climate, on the nature of the soil. So there is not one solution. But we now have experience at large scales. Take the example of Brazil, of course, or smaller scales. In France, we have very good examples that you can improve the soil by some farming techniques. Well, if you put more input of carbon, you leave the residues on the soil so that it comes within the soil. Mulching, you have less tillage or no tillage practices. You have intercrops. Between the crops, you don't keep a nude soil, but you put some green covers. And we now have a lot of experiences about how to make it richer, if you want, in carbon. Because we know that when the soil is richer, the texture is better. then there are more living organisms in the soil. There is a potential of retention of water that increases. And in fact, we had some experiments in Africa that were quite positive about it, how you can improve the soil so that the water retention is better. And we know, as I told this morning, that when you capture carbon, then in fact you are a friend of climate change mitigation. And it's not a weak, it's not a small order, it's a big order. When you think about what you can do, of course it's simplistic, but we call that 4 per mil. So it's an international program of research and development with going to the fields that says that if you increase the carbon content of the soil by 4 per mil, you compensate 80% of the carbon emissions during 1 year. So you see the scale of the problem. It's not nothing. Mm-hmm. So of course, it's not easy to do. It's not really a recipe for solution immediately. Because at the moment, carbon is going out. That is to say, well, in France, we have done some measurements around the country, and it's a slight minus with different zones, of course. So the problem now is to be conscious about the stock of carbons in all zones, because it's very different from Russia to Africa, for instance, because of the temperature and some soil natures. So we have to know more about the soil carbon concentration, and then, you know, to fix targets and to have to share the practices that will improve the nature of the soil, and then to monitor. And I think at world level, now 4 per mil does that linking between the different teams, being specialized on improving the soil.
Okay, good, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, good point. Dr. Finn Kidron, this morning you mentioned about Copenhagen report of a global risk. And you mentioned that hunger and malnutrition as a #1 risk for humanity. As working on agriculture, importance is well known to me myself. But I sometimes wonder why such importance is not well understood by general public. That Copenhagen report was produced by a group of people with great minds and made a clear analysis and indicating that hunger and malnutrition is a #1 global risk. But that message is not well absorbed by general public. Perhaps affluent society like Japan, we feel that we have an abundance of food, not looking at globally. That makes a difference, the way your report says, and general perception from the public in affluent country. How you see that gap of perception?
Björn Lomborg, who's head of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, makes a great effort in disseminating information that comes about as a result of what he does. He writes columns for newspapers, his own column that I get by email about once a month. He's a great expositor, so in some sense there's no excuse for the public not to be aware of this. But the way the Copenhagen Consensus Center works, he gets together panel members. When we evaluated solutions to world problems in 2008 and 2012, he had either 4 or 5 Nobel laureates on the panel and 1 or 2 other economists. And he commissions research papers by experts. The experts are supposed to come up with solutions in their area. Just to give a sense of what those areas are, there are 10 areas. The security challenge in conflict-prone countries, disease control, benefits and costs of alternative strategies to improve educational outcomes, climate change, hunger and malnutrition, water and sanitation, reducing international trade and migration barriers, transnational terrorism, women and development. So these are all important problems. And so as I was mentioning this morning, the hunger and malnutrition solutions always end up very high. And so here's a list. In 2008, number 1, micronutrient supplements for children, vitamin A and zinc. Number 3, micronutrient fortification, iron and salt iodization. 5, biofortification. 6, deworming and other nutrition programs at school. And 9, community-based nutrition promotion. Now, the way the ranking is made, it's based primarily on benefit-cost ratios that the experts come up with.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't have to be an exact ranking according to the benefit-cost ratio. As panel members, we realize for some of the estimates, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with these ratios. So we're free to take that into account. If we find that a solution seems particularly important beyond what the benefit cost ratio is, we can take that into account. So in the end, and I was going to mention an example that Akin mentioned this morning, the stunting. Stunting is a very important problem. So as Akin said, the first 1,000 days in a child's life are extremely important for stunting. 1,000 days is from the time of conception, so that includes the 9 months or so for the mother and then the first 2 years of the child. Research shows that stunting is basically permanent throughout your life. Now through the Copenhagen Consensus Center, estimates have been made for the benefits of providing nutrients during that period.
Okay.
These are astounding benefits. They vary by country. So the top beneficiaries are countries like Indonesia, Philippines, India, Vietnam, Pakistan. Now, the benefits are measured in terms of how much additional income the person with that kind of treatment will get until the age of, I think, 36, discounted to the present. The estimate will depend what discount rate you use. We use either 5% or 3%. Obviously, with 3%, that will give more weight to the future, so the estimates will come out higher. And so, but the cost, so these benefits vary quite a bit across countries. The costs don't vary. I mean, they're basically $100 per person for the period of the treatment. So for every dollar spent, the typical benefit could be on the order of $60 or $70 in the highest beneficiary countries. As I recall, Bangladesh is the median country in terms of benefits, and then there's a whole range of countries. But this is an astoundingly good solution.
Thank you very much.
Can I make a point? And
yes.
Just follow up on what Finn was saying. I think the numbers that he gave and the great work that the Copenhagen panel did, it's so clear, it's so obvious. So the question then really is, why are we not getting that much traction and people taking action on that? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I think that, for me, the political cost of inaction on malnutrition and stunting is almost zero. Mm. Politicians don't get, they get reelected whether they do something about it or not. And at the same time, as you rightly said, it's really you are reducing the capitalization of your society in the future because of lost income, productivity, earnings, and so on. So one of the ways in which we decided to take that on in Africa is to set up what is called the African Leaders for Nutrition. And it's taken me and my colleagues more than 2 years to get the nutrition and stunting issue to the agenda of heads of state in Africa. But we succeeded. In January of this year, the African heads of state now adopted the African Leaders for Nutrition. I sit on it, the former president of Ghana, Kofi Annan, and Bill and Melinda Gates, Bill Gates, and others. I just asked Howard to join us on that. What we're trying to do is to develop an African nutrition index that will rate countries based on the progress they are making in terms of malnutrition, especially also in terms of stunting. So that way you get the political, you can name and shame, as you and I talked about it, that people take action on that. The other one, I think, is how we finance what Finn has said. If it's $100 per person, we know it is. But why is it not getting done? It's not getting done because when people talk about nutrition, they talk to a minister of finance about nutrition. You say it's for the health sector, it's for agriculture sector. People look at it as just one thing. Yeah. But I don't think it is. As I said earlier in the morning, I think framing it putting the frame of gray matter infrastructure to a minister of finance makes a big difference. Because that way they understand that you're talking about infrastructure, and infrastructure is key for having growth. But in this particular case, it's your gray matter infrastructure. And I've found that has helped us a lot in Africa with ministers of finance. And now the issue now is, Finn was talking about the different types of interest rate, discount rates that you use, benefits and all of that. I really feel that what we've got to do is to front load, whether it's support for biofortification that Howard is doing, or fortification, or 1,000 days exclusive breastfeeding, or whether it is water and sanitation that go with it. We've got to front load these things. So I have proposed that we should, come up with nutrition social impact bonds that economies will essentially float to get the resources they need to front load all of these interventions that you're talking about. In the earlier phase, obviously, the returns are going to be quite low. But as you look down the line in terms of kids going to school, having good meals like you had, and staying in school, achieving, and productivity of the workforce grows higher in the future, and you become more competitive and people earn higher incomes, that you will pay back those things over time. Okay. So I think that we need to look for new ways of financing nutrition beyond just the classic public sector budgetary approach. And I think that's one of the things I think we got to do.
Mara, would you like to add on that?
Yes. Well, for stunting, I think you are completely right, and you know more than I do. But I link that to all nutrition policy, because when you think about the nutrition problem now, it's everywhere in the world. It's shared by all continents. Well, so sugar and fat are less expensive than the other goods. When you live in certain areas, you have no shops to buy vegetables, what you call the non-staple. In some areas, the same areas, you have only fast food with too much sugar and too much fat. And so, in fact, I completely agree with you that the problem of nutrition, maybe, is that it is not a sectorial problem. It's urbanism, it's marketing on TV, it's education, it's price of the goods, it's, you have to look at all the policies together.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you know about it, but it's, well, you feel as if eating was a personal decision.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is part of it. But did you know that if you look at TV, then society is slower to come, so you eat more? If your plate is bigger, you eat more because you feel it's smaller. Well, you have a lot of parameters that influence your attitude. And then, of course, you have the collective parameters. Where do you live? Which price? Which power of purchase? You know, all those collective parameters. Do you have sugared drinks at school available? That's really very negative. And you know, so you have to think the whole policy of nutrition.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to open the floor for any possible question. This is a great opportunity to ask question. English or even Japanese is fine. We have a simultaneous translation. And especially, I'd like to have a question from Hope students, younger generation. Or I don't say discriminate against age, but support staff, do you have a microphone to pass to? Yeah, from the back, yeah.
I think it's just dumb luck that this went to not a student. But I have a question about fertilizer, and wondering if you think this is any solution. I'm interested in the ecology of pre-modern Japan, or pre-Meiji Japan, in which waste from the city went back to the countryside and became fertilizer, and went back to the city as food, and there was this cycle that was broken by flush toilets, which is considered the crowning success of public health. Apparently, in the Edo period, farmers paid city people for their waste. And now that we don't do that, we have two problems. There's the fertilizer problem on the farm side, the production side, and then there's this rich nutrients on the consumption side, which has now become a pollution problem. I'm wondering if that cycle can be
any volunteer to respond?
Sure. Yeah. You know, if you take the whole issue of the Green Revolution in Asia, right? The big things that led to the productivity growth was the seed technology, but also the high use of fertilizers. So if you differentiate that from where I come from in Africa, if you look over time, you find that the level of use of fertilizer is actually so small. It used to be, average was about 8 kilograms per hectare. And that's one of the reasons in which productivity of agriculture in Africa was very low. Now, one of the things that we did in 2006, the late Norman Borlaug, and myself organized an African Fertilizer Summit in which we tried to bring attention to the fact that it was not the overuse of fertilizers that was causing problems in Africa. No. It is the lack of use of fertilizer that was leading to a lot of the nutrient degradation that we were having on the continent. Because for 30 years, everybody said, don't use fertilizers because the average globally was too high. But no, that's not our problem in Africa. Our problem was that we were not using fertilizers, and people were basically extending land. And so I think in the times of, we've made a lot of gains. The per capita use, the use, average use per hectare had increased from about 8-9 kilograms per hectare then to close to about 40-45 kilograms per hectare now, which tells you what public policy and political support can do. However, I think Mariam made a very important point in the morning about the structure of the soil. I think so one has to look at the role of inorganic fertilizer, but also the structure of the soil in terms of organic matter, because you may have a lot of land, but if the structure is so weak, then the productivity you're going to get is going to be quite low. And today, we also have quite a lot about what you can do with legumes, crop rotations, and as Marion also mentioned, and a lot of fertigation that you can use to minimize the amount of fertilizers you use. But the point I'm basically trying to say is we shouldn't just be looking at whether we can feed ourselves, 10 billion people, using just organics or things like that. it can never happen because in China, for example, when they try to use the human waste and all these things during that time, don't forget, 30 million people died during that time. So it's combining organic inputs and combining mineral fertilizers. That's the key. We shouldn't get too dogmatic about it. The plant doesn't care, really, where it gets its nutrient from. It just needs a balanced nutrient to be able to grow.
Mario, would you like to counter?
I completely agree with Akin. I would like to add two things. First, you have the health issue. And I can give you the example of heavy metals in France. Farmers did not want the sewage because they feared that heavy metals would accumulate in some place and then come back in the production. So you have to monitor and to give very solid studies so that the customers accept plants coming from those zones. And of course, the biological contamination as well. So you need to be very careful about the fact that you have to certify that the way you do it doesn't pose any health problem. And my second point was that on the top of mineral and organic matters, now we know that we can use some microbes that know how to use, for instance, the air to have inputs in soya, for instance. In Brazil, it's maybe 40 million hectares of soya that do not use fertilizer because there is this kind of phenomenon that is natural, of course, in pulses and in some plants, in legumes. So sometimes you can have some biological innovations that are very helpful as well.
It seems that there's many researchable subjects in the soil, and that is a kind of a last frontier of agricultural science.
Yes, I think it's a very
we
modern.
encourage young scientists to look into soil science. It's a very attractive area. Okay, a question. In the back, sorry. We have many, and I have to choose only one or two more questions. Yes, please.
May I ask my question in Japanese? I am a senior in college. I'm a third-year student in university. And you talked about we have an abundance of main crops, staples, but deficiency in non-staples. Now, many university students in Japan live on their own or live in apartments, etc. And so they have to pay a lot of money just for the rent and use the rest for food. But vegetables are so expensive here in Japan. And even in Japan, I think that we have a lack of non-staples, and we are poor students, and I think that's why we get that impression in any event. So even in Japan, we have a deficiency in non-staples. And Japan is an advanced country, so I think we have to take the lead in resolving this issue. So why is there such a lack of non-staples? Because through crop breeding, mankind has been able to increase productivity. Why could we not do that for non-staples?
Sohoma students, and he's wondering that even Japan, vegetable is expensive. Yeah. It's affluent society. And sometimes he cannot afford to get sufficient vegetable. So no wonder that in developing regions, they cannot afford to get vegetables. So why we have so much price difference, as how you mentioned, staple food and vegetable, and what we can do?
Right. So sometimes when I'm addressing agricultural policy makers, but as I begin my talk, I say, please raise your hand. Now, you personally, what's more important to you? You personally, your health or your income? And of course, everybody raises their hand and they say, health is more important to me than my income. Everybody agrees with that. Okay. And then I go through with them how agricultural policies in the country affect national health, national nutrition, and so national health. So we have this example that even in Japan, there's not enough production of vegetables and fruits and non-staple foods. So then you explain all that. Because of their policies, you get this kind of result, which is not good for national nutrition and national health. And then at the end of my talk, I say, now when you go back to your jobs as agricultural policymakers and you make your decisions, are you going to be guided by what's good for the income and the productivity of agriculture, or are you going to be guided by what's good for national health? Well, unfortunately, they say, well, I still think it's going to be productivity and it's going to be income. So we have a long way to go to change the mindset of policymakers that they have to really think and regard how agricultural policy affects nutrition, the food supply, and the nutrition and the health in the country.
Okay. Thank you. Really, I want to take more questions, but unfortunately, time is coming up. And responding to that question in Japanese, 現在の主食と言われている米とか小麦
So staple foods include rice, wheat, and corns. We had spent so much research funding, so we've been able to improve productivity in these areas thanks to rich research. But for non-staple food, vegetables, there is not as much research done on a global scale. The same applies to Japan as well. So under such circumstances, when you have rich research, a lot of research, if that succeeds, you'll be able to reduce the price of staple food. So it's a matter of comparison. Vegetables which are not studied are handicapped in terms of the price. Prices tend to be higher. We all want to eat, but with a limited amount of budget, we tend to spend more money on staple food to fill your stomach. But think of the countries that have lower income. On the average, they tend to eat starch, which is less costly, and eat less vegetables that are more expensive. Some time ago, in Japan, we used to consume more vegetables. The vegetable consumption is declining today. When I was a student, 48 years ago, I was in the agricultural department, horticultural department of Agricultural University. I actually changed my major to the crop production. But if I stayed there, I may have been able to contribute to the overall global nutrition by studying more about vegetables. Stable food is critical for us, but it's not just that. I'd like to encourage young scientists to be more interested in other non-stable food, including vegetables.
We enjoyed this great dialogue, having 4 great minds of the world. And I'd like to ask you to show our appreciation to panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
「ただいまより10分間の休憩とさせていただきます。次のストリーム3、持続的発展、水資源の将来は14時45分から開始いたします。なお、3階ではストリーム1およびストリーム2も同時開催しております。それぞれの会場間の移動は自由です。引き続き、ノーベルプライズダイアログ東京2018をお楽しみください。 Before we begin the parallel discussion streams, we would like to offer a minute of silent prayer in memory of the victims of the Great East Japan Earthquake at 2:46 p.m., the time the earthquake occurred. We will now begin our moment of silence. 黙祷. Mokto終わります. This concludes our moment of silence. We will now begin our next session, Sustainability, Water in the Future, moderated by Professor Oki. Professor Oki, panelists, please.
Sorry.
Okay, maybe we can start the second half of the afternoon session, stream 3, Sustainability, Water in the Future. And we have the 3 outstanding panelists on the stage, and Hans Deisenhofer, and the laureate, and also that Mohammed Abzaid, His Excellencies, and also that Dr. Marion Gu. Okay, thank you. And it's water and food. And at first, I will raise 3 questions to all the 3 panelists, and they will give their ideas. And after that, we will open the floor for discussion. So I hope we can take a few questions from the floor. And finally, that panelists will conclude and deliver their messages to you. The first question would be that how water is important for food production from biological, from water, and food viewpoints. So Hans, would you please open the discussion?
Okay. Well, water is probably the most important ingredient of living organisms. And that is not surprising because I think there is a widespread belief that that life originated in the oceans on Earth, and therefore water was, of course, everywhere. So if we nowadays look at living cells, the interior is filled with water solution. Many of the proteins, and that's my own field of interest, many of the proteins are water soluble. They take their final shape and their function only in water solution. So water is indispensable. And also from the point of view of photosynthesis, another of my interests, water is the origin of the oxygen in our atmosphere. And this is because photosynthetic organisms, at least most of them, use the energy of light first to split water into oxygen and hydrogen, and in this way conserve the light energy. And so water is a really indispensable substance, and that's probably why we are talking about it.
Okay, thank you. And how about Mahmoud, about how water is important for food production?
Well, it goes without saying that food security and water security are deeply interconnected, and their sustainability is also dependent on climate change.
Okay.
As the UN proclaims, the world is hungry because it is thirsty. Definitely, there is a water crisis today. Yet, the crisis is not only about having too little water to satisfy our needs, but also it is a crisis of managing water so badly that billions of people and the environment suffer badly. Under the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda is a dedicated goal for water that calls to ensure availability and sustainability management of water and sanitation for all. The several targets and indicators included under the goals address key issues such as reducing water scarcity, increasing water use efficiency, improving water quality and wastewater treatment, and enhancing integrated water resources management at the national and transboundary basin levels.
Thank you very much. Marion, what is your view on the food and water?
Well, we have worked about food and water for FAO, and in fact, we have looked at 4 factors. First, if you want the quantity of food, you need water to produce it. To produce it, to transform it, all the chain needs water. Then about the quality. So, you need safe drinking water, and in a way, it belongs to your food intake. You need safe water for the industry, so that then the food is safe. So you have a problem of quality of water, and it's linked to the quality of food. Then you have a problem of access to water. And there is a link, especially in the countries where the women are in charge of water collection. Because if the water is far away, they will spend hours collecting the water, and then they won't be able to give time enough to the children or to the preparation of the food. So there is a problem of access to water that is quite important. And then the stability, because of course, if you have no stability in the water access, you can have problems for food production, especially if the water is missing during the season of production. So in fact, you have the 4 same factors for water than you have for food, where you need quantity, quality, access, and stability. And really, food and water are completely linked.
So you see the commonality between the food supply, food security, and water supply, water security.
Yes, of course. And you have the same factors, and really it's completely linked. So water is life, as you said.
Okay, so do you have any comments on that, the current proposal, the messages so far to each other?
Well, I suppose you have such an experience in your country about how water is essential for life.
In our region, it's one
so
of the
from
most
Egypt,
driest regions in the world.
Yeah.
And water is so important. And but irrespective of that fact, there is some misuse of water, over irrigation, use too much water at homes and so forth, and that makes the role of the decision makers so difficult to be able to manage and control the water and water losses.
Okay, Mary, on that, I would say that the water supply and food supply is very similar in some senses. However, there are a very big difference between food and water. Food, as introduced by that Professor Osumi in the morning, we intake only 70 grams per person per day of protein, a similar amount for the fat, and probably that 100, 200, 300 grams of the carbohydrate per day per person. However, we intake 1 to 2 liters of water a day, so the quantity we need is much more than food by weight. So that is a big difference.
There are many big differences. I was, making the parallel just to be sure that we don't forget that quality, quantity, stability, and access are both questions.
These points are very important.
But, the pricing is very different.
Yes.
In many countries, you have no price to the water. And I think when you have shortages, as you said, and that we know that water will be missing, it's very important to have an economic model about water access. Because we see countries where there are subsidies for energy, and then pumping and pumping. And of course, we know that groundwater is missing now, and so, well, again, there is a link between water and energy. And I think a big difference between food and water is that sometimes the use of water, well, maybe is, I couldn't say that, too cheap, or people don't realize how precious it is. So do we have to give a price to water so that people realize that water is really gold?
Mahmoud, yes?
Yes, water pricing has been identified as one of the water management tools. But in our parts of the world, in the Arab world, it's a very political issue. People think that this is against religion. And up to now, in most of the Arab countries, water pricing is not yet applied. But we're trying, as technicians, we're trying to get around this difficulty by introducing the word water valuing. So we give it a weight rather than giving a price. So this is a more acceptable phenomenon, I guess.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe we can discuss later, so let us go for the second question. Second question is that what are the potential and critical risks in food and water securities in the future? What do you foresee that what could be the potential risk in a stable and nutritious food supply or supported by the water resources management?
Well,
yes.
I personally am somewhat pessimistic in that direction because it is clear that in many parts of the world, the water supply may become less reliable with climate change. And so it is necessary to enact some kind of a redistribution, and this will meet with resistance. And so it could very well come to war over water. I mean, and how sort of rigid a lot of people see a water supply is easiest to observe, let's say, in the U.S. West, where there are a lot of areas where people have old water rights. So essentially, you have a stream, and the owner of the part that is upstream, most upstream, has sort of the most right to water, and then he can basically use everything without penalty, and the next are waiting in vain for. So and to convince such a person to give up is very, very complicated, and requires either a lot of money or some really determined legislative approach. And especially if this is then happening between countries, that one country is upstream from the other, it can easily become difficult to resolve the situation without shooting or, yeah.
Thank you, Mahmoud. I know that you have been working on that issue for a long time, and you can take maybe several hours to explain what will happen and what happened before, but would you please concisely show us the review?
Water scarcity is one of the risks, serious risks. It's mainly linked to geographical, climatological location, but it's now a common occurrence in all countries. Its main drivers can be summarized as follows. Drought, which is the number one cause of flood shortages in developing countries, mainly due to climate variability, and has caused more deaths in the past 100 years than any other natural disaster. Pollution growth, population growth, which is directly affecting availability of water resources and has led to the decline in the per capita availability of fresh water resources. Degraded water quality and pollution of surface and groundwater sources. Major problems affecting the water quality are independently treated domestic sewage and inadequate controls on the discharge of industrial wastewater. Climate variability and climate change that threaten the availability of water in many regions of the world in both quantity and quality. The risk of serious conflicts over transboundary waters is increasing, with the most negative impacts on the poor and vulnerable. Inefficient use, especially in food production, which means that poorly managed water resources can make it scarce and leading famine. The Arab region, as an example of water scarce areas, is becoming increasingly dependent on food imports because of demographic pressure, rapid urbanization, water scarcity, and climate change. importing agriculture food products in 2015 amounting to about 337 billion cubic meters per year of virtual water, exceeding its regionally produced food of about 295 billion cubic meters per year of virtual water. The cereal import dependency ratio is above average in the region compared to the world. These are some of the major risks.
Don't you think that we need to explain somewhat about what is virtual water import?
Yeah. Well,
yes.
As we know, virtual water is the amount of water which is used to produce products that are imported. But I think you have done considerable work in that area.
I did, but let me explain briefly about what is virtual water import. The Mohammed said that in Arabic regions, that due to the population growth, they need more food and more water to produce the food. However, their water is not enough in their region. Therefore, which is more rational, to import water and produce food, or they grow them, make the crops outside the region and where the water is available and produce food and import the food? Then here is the price. The food costs like that the 1,000, 2,000 US dollars a ton of the price, maybe. But the water costs approximately $1 a cubic meter. So 1,000 times different. Therefore, it's very irrational to import water and produce food rather than produce food outside where the water is available and import the food. And that water accounts more than the domestic food production in Arabic region. That's the Mohammed introduced right now. Okay, then water could be the potential risk for the water and food.
I completely agree with both of you. You know, I was looking at the figures. In fact, it's 263 transboundary lakes and river basin, and they account for 60% of fresh water flows in the world. So transboundary water. Then it's 300 groundwater aquifers that are transboundary. So you see the number of problems that could arise with water scarcity. So for me, it would be, well, the threat number one, the risk number one. The risk number two, and maybe we forget that sometimes, is floods and drought. I mean, you have two risks because, well, they are both terrible. I mean, you know that floods can be disasters as well. And so we know that with climate variability, the number of floods and the drought will increase, both of them. So, well, with disasters for people, especially in river basins that are quite low, at a low level, and we know that it's more than 2 billion people that live in river basins that are susceptible to risk coming from water. Then, of course, you have, when you are missing some water, sometimes people take water from the ground aquifers, and if they pump too much, then, you know, if the sea is not far away, then they they have salinity in the soil. It's difficult to say for me, but they get salinity in the soil. And if you have too much salinity, then the soil is sterile. It doesn't produce anymore. So you can have several risks linked to water, and some of them, well, wars, floods, and salinity, I mean, they are very big risks. And what I would say concerning trade in a way could be an insurance for countries that have a problem of deficit of water. And that's why it's very important that in WTO, now we discuss about the rules not to block exports, because if we don't secure the exchanges when there are shortages, then it will be very difficult for the people that rely on imports you know, for national security, it would be very difficult. So you noticed that before, WTO was about regulation, about tax for imports, and now more and more the regulations have to be on no limitation of exports, so that you stabilize the amount of food that people can be sure to get. So it's amazing how in, well, let's say 20 years or less than 20 years, the problem is exactly the reverse than it was before.
What made the problem reverse?
We have noticed that, you know, in 2008, we had a crisis on rice, we had a crisis on wheat, and every time when there was a crisis on staple food, again, we talk about staple food because it's basis of well, the food system, the exporters countries stopped exporting, and then the prices rised very quickly in countries that were in deficit, and so that was not affordable for the people. So that started with rice and wheat crisis. You know, you remember the Australian, well, we can develop if you want, but you remember the Australian drought. And Australia is a big cereal producer. And so we had some, well, maybe it's a butterfly effect if you want. That is to say, you have drought in a place in the world, the other one sees that there is a problem, and the other exporters block exports so that they don't have problems in their own countries, and then it makes the volatility and the price increase more. So that's why it's very important, if you want to rely on what you said, that is to say, water elsewhere, that is cheaper and easily accessible, then you have to secure the trade rules.
Yeah, since Japan is importing a lot of food, and the calorie basis, more than half, depends on the outside Japan. So that point, free trade is very important for us, critical for us. Okay, then now we know that there could be a potential risks like the governing and the free trade issues, and also the transboundary issues, and the climate change will enhance the variability of the available water resources and cause the variability of food production. Then how we will be able to well manage these risks and develop sustainable, stable food and water supplies through the aid of science and technology or the academic researches. What's your perspective, Hans?
Well, I mean, in principle, there's enough water on the planet. Most of it, or a lot of it, is not immediately usable. So we have to work on developing better methods to desalinate, for example. We, of course, have to, in many parts of the world, try to bring people to conserve water. Which is a really big task, because as long as you're sort of opening the faucet and it flows, nobody likes to think about, oh, I'm wasting some precious resource. And so there's a lot in technical potential, probably, but also in enlightening the users of water.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, I would say that a holistic system approach relying on integrated water resources management must replace the current traditional fragmented approach in managing water, which is no longer viable. Integrated water resources management is defined as a process which promotes the coordinated development and management of water, land, and related resources in order to maximize the resultant economic and social welfare in an equitable manner without compromising the sustainability of vital ecosystems. Innovative state-of-the-art technologies and knowledge can help in the complex water management decision-making. Water and agriculture decision support systems and farm management tools can support farm managers in making appropriate decisions on irrigation scheduling, water requirements, combining information on soil type, crop development stage, and water deficit, remote sensing applications for crop mapping and irrigation, drought monitoring, flood mapping, evapotranspiration, and climate change analysis have been very useful. I think with demand rising and supplies dwindling, non-conventional water resources is the indispensable solution to fill the gap between supply and demand. Reuse of treated wastewater is increasingly going to be an important source of food production.
Thank you. Marion, how do you think about it?
I would make a difference between agriculture that is irrigated and rain-fed agriculture. For agriculture that is irrigated, I think you said everything, Mahmoud. That is to say, we have to organize to have more efficiency. You know, maybe the marginal irrigation system that is quite good. That is to say, you only use it in very special times of the year, and otherwise you rely on rain-fed agriculture. So there are a lot of techniques and technical improvements that are here and that will come as well in the coming years. For rain-fed agriculture, then it's really, as you said, a systemic way to think about it. That is to say, you have to look at the landscape. Do you have water in some seasons and no water in other seasons? Do you have to stock it? Do you have to retain it with trees? Do you have to have strips so that it doesn't go on the slopes? So you really have to look at the landscape and to see how to manage the water to optimize the use of the water. And then, of course, you can rely on genetics so that you select either plants that don't need a lot of water, because with no water there is no life. I mean, you cannot say, well, we will be magicians, and no, you always need water. But sometimes you would need less water, or even more interesting maybe is that you would need water in a season when you have water. If I give you the example of maize in France that is cultivated in the southwest, the problem is not that we are lacking water, but we are lacking water during the growing seasons. Oh, yeah. So we had to select some maize that had a different growing season so that it was possible to survive. So you have a lot of possible improvements, but I agree that there is no one solution. I mean, genetics won't solve the problems, and a lot of problems, of course, are more political and more organizational problems. How do you organize a basin? Yeah. How do you organize negotiations between countries? How do you share the water between agriculture, industry, and population? I mean, obviously, maybe it's scale number one.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Hans, you were not so optimistic against the future of food and water, but do you think that the suggestion by Marion that the new variety which required less water, do you think that's kind of development possible by science?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. We heard just in the previous discussion I participated in examples of more or less surprise discoveries that you change the level of a certain protein expressed in a plant, and it suddenly is 25% more water efficient. And The example illustrates a little bit of a problem or a serious problem we have. We didn't really understand plants very well yet. So we are largely dependent on experiments, sort of large-scale, broad experiments to find some chance improvements. And it would be much better if we could say, okay, here's a computer map of the genome, and I make a change here, and then the water use is optimized, and so on. So that's probably coming. Whether it will come soon enough, that is the question. I mean, the planet is approaching very quickly a critical moment, and I think the whole human species is approaching a critical moment.
Okay, so Mahmoud and Marion, as a bottom line, are you optimistic or pessimistic for the food and water in the future?
Well, I am optimistic.
Okay, we can manage.
With better management, I think we can overcome the difficulty of the water scarcity. But we also need to keep in mind the role of the governments as key actors, the role of farmers, water users. So I am optimistic.
Okay, how about you, Marion?
Well, now I don't speak as a scientist, but as a person, of course, because either you are optimistic or pessimistic in life. I am more on the optimistic, reasonably optimistic side. So yes, I am optimistic, but I cannot explain you why. Because, of course, there will be a lot of improvements. And, well, the past history shows that usually, well, wisdom or adaptation is there. But I cannot prove you that we will have the solution. I just see grounds for improvement. When we were talking about soils, of course, if you improve the soils, you improve the green water stock, and you know that the green water stock is the ones that makes the plant grow. So, you know, you always think of water in rivers and in the sea, but in fact, the most important part of water is within the soil, and the plant drinks in the water, and so if the soil is a good soil, again, you have more retention. So we see some fields of improvement.
Thank you very much. So please think about the final messages after the question and answers. Okay, let's take a few questions if you may have from the floor. Oh, by the way, this is the time 7 years ago that the first tsunami attacked. So if you evacuated to the higher places, you could be safe, and if you didn't, you are not here. Okay, any question? Okay, I see 3 over there, so please come from the right to the stage.
Thank you very much to the panelists for
Could you please identify yourself?
My name is Yongama Majibi. I'm from the Republic of South Africa. I've got 2 key questions just to save time and not do a speech. One is we speak of sustainability is key here, and sustainability speaks of to use the resources of today but not discriminate against future generation. But to His Excellency, the President of the Arab Water Council, I'd just like to ask, how do we strengthen those ties as the Nile River is a very important type of river within your region and the Arab nation? How do we strengthen those ties between those nations over there and make sure there's cooperation, because that water is very important for everyone amongst the region? And one more, I think one of the risks that we did not identify is pollution is a key risk. How do we make sure that the business and the private sector because they tend to pollute sometimes, and they are not sanctioned for that. How do we make sure that we put structures in place to sanction those who do not abide by water restrictions and make sure that we educate? I think this commodifying water for me is not a good thing. How do we make sure we educate society to use water more efficiently and effectively? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So please answer along with your final message. And then, about the sustainability in Nile Basin, of course, Mohammed, would you please think about it? And pollution, would you please take, Marian? Okay, thank you. Next question, please. Yes. With the microphone.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Lindelwa. I'm from Swaziland in Southern Africa. My question is, we spoke of water becoming, the scarcity of water becoming a source of conflict. Can we look at it at a point, are we at a point where we can think of water security as a national security issue, in that when planning things like military strategies for preventing conflicts, can we also think of water security in those lines, in that water should not only be discussed in by natural resource ministries, but also the Ministry of Defense as well? Are we at a point in time where the water scarcity and food scarcity has already become points of conflict?
Okay, thank you very much. So all of you, please consider to include in the final message. Okay, another one. Yes, please. Okay, this lady first.
Thank you for the very great talk. I teach geography in Japanese university, and I was wondering, water shortage is very important problem in agriculture to raise productivity or in every agricultural product. And I think desalination plants are built in developed countries, but it needs high expenses. And how can developing countries solve this problem? And in addition to this problem, if we succeed in supplying nutrients or micronutrients or safe water to every people, then total population will be raised more rapidly. How can we is this phenomenon desirable for the Earth? How can, please, I want to listen your perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. So the question is that the first one is the water is scarce. Then in a developed nation, maybe we can apply the desalination technology to produce fresh water from seawater. However, what could be the possible measures in the developing states? Okay, that is one question. And another one is, anyway, the population grows and water demand, food demand increases. Is it good for the Earth environment or not? Well, they are scientists, so it's maybe very hard to answer good or bad, because that's not decided by scientific evidence. But anyway, so they're the mandate for them to answer. Okay, a final question from, yes, the gentleman there.
My name is Mohammed. I came from Egypt and I study at Yokohama National University. I want to get back to the question that was addressed at the very beginning of this session, which was the lack of access of so many people on the earth to have food or to have water. It's going to be the same. Actually, so far in this dialogue, all the panelists have been discussing this problem from scientific perspective. So I just want to know, how much do you think that politics share in this problem? Because in my humble opinion, I guess that politics share much more than science does. Thank you.
You mean that the politics can solve the issues rather than the scientific knowledge and technologies? I personally agree, but this is not a place to tell that. Okay, so every panelist, you have 2 minutes each. So Hans, would you please start?
Well, I wish I had understood the questions better acoustically. Yeah, it is very difficult for me to sit here and and understand what is said on stage and what is said through the sound system. But I will try anyway. So there was one question that touched upon desalination, and certainly this is an issue that technically is looking relatively promising, but it is requiring an enormous amount of investment, and therefore, let's say a plant that is driven by solar energy, for example, and works. So the actual problem is an economical, that you can you bring enough capital to work to install such things, and I think that's beyond my ability to answer.
Thank you very much. Okay, Mahmoud.
There has been several questions, I guess, that I could comment on. The first one is the cooperation between the Nile Basin countries. And I would like to refer to an initiative which was agreed upon between all the 11, or the 10 actually at that time, in 1999, the 10 countries agreed to establish an agreement which is called the Nile Basin Initiative. And in this initiative, all the countries participated, and they have 2 tracks. One track is to present, each country would present 2 projects, 2 development projects, and they would seek funding for these projects for all the 10 countries. And the second track is to develop an agreement between the 10 countries. And this has been working quite well in the first track, and also in the second track. And the countries came very close to an agreement now.
Okay.
This is the cooperation between the countries. Well, another question is related to use of non-conventional water resources. Here I refer, desalination is one of them.
Yeah.
But we still count on other non-conventional water resources, recycling of treated wastewater, recycling of agricultural water. And desalination has been accepted now as a very efficient and practical way in the Arab world. For example, in the Gulf area, there is 60% of the total desalination waters in the world, worldwide. And in Saudi Arabia, only 30%. So the cost of desalination is becoming less and less, and I think we will see more of that with the introduction of solar energy also.
Yeah.
let's see.
Another question about that, how to avoid the conflicts over water.
Of course, cooperation, I guess. Cooperation among countries and try to come up with agreements which are accepted by all. The role of the United Nations, there has been several attempts in navigable, non-navigational rivers agreement, groundwater agreement. So more cooperation, I guess, would help to avoid conflicts.
Thank you very much. So Marion, floor is for you.
Well, about the fact that as the population is growing, we will need more and more water, and safe water, of course. I just wanted to give you one figure, and so that then we think about what will be the limits. So every year you have 110 billion liters of rainfall for 1 year. So when you link that with what you heard about what we need, you see that the problem is not the lack of water, because we have rainfall, we have blue water, we have green water. So the problem is more about bad use, about how it is the variability of the access to water. And in fact, we know that at all stages, you have a lot of waste and losses of water. Obviously, I heard that in Japan, there are leakages in the circuit, in the network. You say leakages? You say, well, water comes out of the circuit. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
So you have losses. In France, I know it's sometimes 60% of losses in the network. So we know that, in fact, the problem is more the economy to prevent the losses, or the economy to invest in drop-to-drop irrigation, or the economy to invest, as you said, in desalination factories, than the fact that we will lack water in general. So in fact, it will be a balance between water, energy, and with the cost of that. I think at the end of the day, the problem is where you put your money. And for the pollution, the problem, in fact, there is a whole system to prevent pollution first. Usually when you settle an industry, you need to get the right to work. And to have the right to work, you should have prevention systems so that you don't pollute. But then some people pollute, so you need to have the capacity to control, the capacity to identify the source of the pollution, and then the capacity to give big fines and to remediate. So it's really a question of right to workforce, and then right to work first, and then a system to control.
Thank you very much. So I think that we have now that warmed up, and the discussion will be much exciting about the time's up, and hope that this stream 3 could be a very of interest for you. And if you're interested in about the water issues, that there will be the World Water Forum in Brasilia in coming weeks, and you'll see a lot of news coming out from that forum. So please pay attention, and I hope that you will pay attention not only food but water as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
ただいまより25分間の休憩とさせていただきます。16時5分より未来に向けてと題してパネルディスカッションやノーベル賞受賞者による総括パネルディスカッションを開始します。引き続きノーベルプライズダイアログ東京2018をお楽しみください。Now we would like to take a 25-minute break. Our next session, entitled Towards the Future, comprises of a panel discussion and a concluding panel discussion by Nobel laureates, and will begin at 4:05 p.m. Please stay with us for the rest of the Nobel Prize Dialogue, Tokyo 2018.